Hello to all fellow classmates, and welcome to the overview of the seventh module, Privacy and Confidentiality. I'm Jamal Johnson, and also with me is Frank Vera. Once again, this presentation will be separated into two parts. The first will summarize the module itself. The second will introduce and discuss an article that ties into this week's lesson. There's a lot to cover this time, so let's begin. This module begins by tying into a concept we are all familiar with, the federal policy for protection of human subjects, 45 CFR 46 subpart A, better known to most of us as the Common Rule. Here we examine how the Common Rule helps to define privacy and confidentiality. This module will also discuss some research methods and topics that raise concerns about privacy, identify some standard methods for providing confidentiality, and discuss relevant laws other than the Common Rule. In this case, we can see that the Common Rule specifies that institutional review boards, or IRBs, must determine that there are adequate provisions for protecting the privacy of subjects and maintaining confidentiality of data. The Common Rule is only one such document to attempt to codify privacy and confidentiality protections when conducting research. Other such guidelines that take steps to do so are provided by the American Anthropological Association, the Oral History Association, the American Psychological Association, and the American Sociological Association. We'll continue the module by more closely examining another document that helps us to further define the concepts of privacy and confidentiality, the IRB Guidebook, also known as OHRP 1993. OHRP 1993 helps us look at these concepts of privacy and confidentiality in very simple terms. Here, privacy is defined as having control over the extent, timing, and circumstances of sharing oneself either physically, behaviorally, or intellectually with others. Confidentiality, on the other hand, is concerned with treatment of information that an individual has disclosed in a relationship of trust and with the expectation that it will not be divulged to others in ways that are inconsistent with the understanding of the original disclosure without permission. So, what does this mean? It means that although privacy and confidentiality are closely related, they are not identical. Privacy is related to methods of gathering information from research subjects. Confidentiality refers to obligations of researchers and institutions to appropriately protect the information disclosed to them. Confidentiality procedures allow subjects to decide what measure of control over their personal information they are willing to relinquish to researchers. Accordingly, please note that it is not always the case that identifiable information provided by research subjects must be protected from disclosure. Some subjects want to be identified and quoted. So, for example, some may agree to have their photographs, audio, or video recordings published or otherwise made available to the public. So, how do we determine what information is or should be considered private? The Common Rule here helps us again. The 2018 revision of the Common Rule defines private information to mean information about behavior that occurs in a context in which an individual can reasonably expect that no observation or recording is taking place, and information that has been provided for specific purposes by an individual and that the individual can reasonably expect will not be made public, e.g., a medical record. This means that, as our helpful graphic indicates, that what is defined as private information heavily rests on the subject's reasonable assumption of privacy. Applying the reasonable assumption standard is not a simple task. Most, for instance, would assume that it would be unreasonable to assume that behavior on a street corner or a public park is private, but reasonable to assume that behavior in homes is private. But what about how technology applies? Is it reasonable to make a video recording of parents interacting with their children at a public park without their knowledge? Probably not. Reasonable assumptions regarding privacy will vary from culture to culture and setting to setting. For example, in some cultures, health information is considered very private, but in others, information about people's health is part of the community dialogue and widely shared. A closely related concept is that an individual's ability to control access to their bodies and to their personal information is not universal, but determined by a variety of factors, including socioeconomic status, age, and circumstance. As an example, information about birth records is public information, while information about personal stock portfolios is not. Children have different rights to privacy than adults. Institutionalized persons may have significant limitations on their ability to control personal information. All of these things should be taken into account by the researcher when considering what is and is not private information, as well as a reasonable expectation thereof. Unsurprisingly, concerns about privacy in the context of research are not uncommon. While not an exhaustive list, our module does provide some helpful examples to give context and guidance in these cases. For example, in some observational studies, researchers participate in the activities being observed, and the subjects know that researchers have dual roles as both participants and researchers. However, if subjects are observed and private identifiable information is gathered about them without their knowledge and consent, there is a clear violation of their right to privacy. Is such covert observation always wrong? Well, it depends. Determining whether covert observation can be considered ethically sound depends on answers to questions such as whether the invasion of privacy is justified by the potential benefit in the study, and what, if anything, the subjects will be told after the data are collected. A good example here might be criminology studies. Researchers might observe public illegal activity, such as drug trafficking, from a distance to gather data, provided that data remains anonymous and poses no threat to the participants. Focus groups are unique settings in which both privacy and confidentiality may be issues. In effect, focus group participants relinquish control of the extent, timing, and circumstance of sharing themselves because other group members may repeat what is said outside of the group. This may occur even if researchers emphasize that comments made during the focus group session should not be repeated. Researchers may protect recordings and transcripts themselves, but they have no real authority to enlist participants in agreements to appropriately protect the information shared. When using focus groups, researchers can encourage participants to be as honest and open as they can, but when the topic warrants, they should also encourage them to remain mindful of the limits on the researcher's ability to protect their privacy. Snowball sampling is a recruitment technique in which research participants are asked to assist researchers in identifying other potential subjects. If the topic of the research is not sensitive or personal, it may be appropriate for subjects to provide researchers with names of people who might be interested in participation. However, if the topic is sensitive or personal, such as the fact that someone was adopted, considerable care should be taken so that potential subjects' privacy is not violated. In this case, subjects assisting with recruiting could provide information about the research to potential subjects rather than giving the researcher direct names of potential subjects. Next, we look at the somewhat complex topic of intrusive questions and how they relate to privacy. Invasions of privacy can occur if subjects are asked questions that they find intrusive. Therefore, if a survey instrument or an interview script contains questions that individuals are likely to find intrusive, they must be informed about the nature of the questions in advance. Accordingly, studies about possible topics that are a sensitive nature should include a disclosure in the consent form about the sensitive nature of the questions. The survey instrument or interview process must also be designed so that subjects may choose not to answer any question that makes them uncomfortable or that they want to skip for any reason. Cultural standards should be taken into account when designing research. Topics that are considered appropriate in one setting may be offensive and off limits in another. If a study is obviously about stigmatizing conditions, illegal activities, or life experience that subjects may not want others to know about, communications with the subjects should not reveal their participation in the study to others. To do so would violate the subject's right to privacy. Study title should be carefully considered and is often best if title does not reveal sensitive information about subjects. In addition, a method of communication that is of particular concern is email. Employee email in particular is not secure at all, and some personal accounts may be accessed by anyone in the family. Telephone calls to subjects at home may also be of concern. It may be appropriate to script calls carefully so that no information is revealed about the caller or the subject to anyone other than the subject. In some cases, it may be appropriate to remind subjects to prevent possible violations of privacy in their homes by, for example, closing browsers after completing an online survey on a sensitive topic. So, if some methods of communication aren't necessarily secure and data has a habit of finding its way to places that it should not, how do we as researchers best protect the privacy of our research subjects? Researchers endeavor to provide confidentiality to their subjects by appropriately protecting information the subjects disclose. The potential risk of harm to subjects if identifiable data were inadvertently disclosed is the key factor for determining what kinds of protection are needed. The easiest and most ideal way to protect research data is simply not to collect information that could identify subjects. Just don't do it. Collection of direct identifiers, such as names or email addresses, or indirect identifiers, such as information that could be used to deduce subjects' identities, should be avoided. If, however, researchers plan to retain individually identifiable data that could place participants at risk of harm if inadvertently disclosed, researchers need to design procedures to protect the data during collection, storage, analysis, and reporting. These procedures could include things like creating keys linking subjects' name to unique numbers associated with the data, securing encrypted data on secure servers, removing identifiers when data collection is completed, reporting data in aggregate, and creating misleading identifiers in articles or presentations. Consent forms, when used, should clearly explain who will have access to identifiable data, both in the present and in the future, and describe any future uses of the data. The consent forms must also contain a statement describing the extent, if any, to which confidentiality of records identifying the subject will be maintained. Also, the most recent revision of the Common Rule requires that researchers must include one of the following statements on the consent form. Either a statement that identifiers will be removed from identifiable private information, and after this data is de-identified, it could be used for future research studies or distributed to another researcher, or a statement that after the subject's information is collected as part of research, even if identifiers are removed, it will not be used or distributed for future research. Researchers should consult with the reviewing IRB about other applicable state, local, or international privacy laws that might apply. Now, we close the lesson with a final review of important privacy protection rule, the Certificate of Confidentiality. Certificates of confidentiality are issued by the National Institutes of Health. It's an agency of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to protect identifiable research information from compelled disclosure. Certificates of confidentiality, they protect all copies of information, documents, and biospecimens that are collected or used by the investigator during the research. The certificate protections also covers copies of information, documents, and biospecimens that are shared for other research activities. These protections are permanent and do not expire. Certificates of confidentiality do not override the requirement to report the suspicion of child abuse or neglect or other applicable federal, state, or local law mandating reporting of such things, such as reporting of communicable disease or elder abuse. So that is a limitation of the certificate. Other federal agencies, such as the DOJ, the Department of Justice, may also provide agency-specific protections that apply to research conducted or funded by the agency. Under the Certificate of Confidentiality policy issued in 2017, NIH-funded investigators don't need to apply for a certificate of confidentiality, nor will they receive a physical certificate. Instead, the NIH issues certificates of confidentiality automatically for NIH-funded grants, cooperative agreements, contracts, and intramural research projects funded wholly or in part by the NIH that collect or use identifiable sensitive information. Investigators are responsible for determining whether the NIH-funded research they conduct is automatically issued a certificate. Investigators must comply with the certificates of confidentiality policy requirements, which include limited circumstances when the investigator may release a participant's identifiable information and informing anyone that receives a copy of the protected information about the certificate protections and disclosure restrictions. Note that it is critical that researchers must inform participants about the protections and limitations to the protections with a certificate of confidentiality. So, as we can see, privacy and confidentiality deal with different aspects of a study design, and how these two issues are handled translate into issues of trust and security for a research participant. Now we'll move on to our related article, which deals with a case of when does data collection become a breach of privacy? Now, today we are presenting for your consideration a study that forced the public and the research community to confront a hard question: when does data collection become a breach of privacy? In 2012, Facebook conducted an experiment involving nearly 700,000 users. Without their knowledge, Facebook manipulated users' news feeds by filtering out certain positive or negative emotional words. The goal was to determine whether altering what people saw would change what they saw themselves posted, a phenomenon called the researchers called emotional contagion. The results showed that emotions were slightly reinforced by exposure. Users shown more positive content tended to post more positive updates. Those shown less positive content posted more negatively. From a behavioral science standpoint, however, that finding wasn't revolutionary, and the measures taken may not have justified the result. Here, the controversy was not so much about the outcome, which again was not controversial or revolutionary or even a surprise, but about how the study was conducted and what it revealed about privacy and confidentiality. First, talk about privacy. Nearly 689,003 individuals, well, exactly 689,003 individuals, had their feeds altered without their awareness. They were not told they were part of an experiment, and they were not given the option to opt out. Yes, they had agreed to Facebook's terms of service, but checking a box agreeing to lengthy legal language is not the same as being informed that your emotional environment will be intentionally manipulated for research purposes. In the article we have available, a law professor at the University of Maryland argues that the absence of informed consent is a serious ethical breach, and I think I agree there. But beyond consent, there is a deeper issue. Users believed they were interacting in a private social space, or at least a semi-private social space, not participating in a controlled psychological experiment. When individuals share personal updates, reactions, and emotional expressions on social media, they may understand that that data may be collected or even viewed. But there is a meaningful difference between passive data collection and active experimental manipulation. In this case, the platform, being Facebook, did not simply observe behavior, it intervened in users' informational environment in order to shape it, and that raises concerns about confidentiality. Although published paper reported aggregate findings, the experiment relied on access to deeply personal data, emotional language in posts, reactions, and engagement patterns. The ability of a corporation to algorithmically filter, categorize, and analyze that information at scale without explicit disclosure challenges traditional assumptions about what remains private in digital spaces. So, again, as stated here, informed consent is a core requirement precisely because participants must understand how their personal information will be used. In traditional research settings, confidentiality safeguards are clearly explained, or at least should be clearly explained: what data will be collected, how it will be stored, and who will have access, and how it will be anonymized. In this case, users were never told their emotional expressions were being systematically analyzed as part of a formal research study later published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. This study exposed how vulnerable personal digital expression can be. Users assume a degree of contextual privacy, that what they post is seen by friends with an algorithmic system designed to personalize content. They do not typically assume that the platform itself is deliberately altering emotional inputs to test psychological outcomes. Confidentiality in research is not only about stripping names from datasets, it is also respecting the boundaries participants believe exist around their personal information. When those boundaries are crossed without notice, trust erodes. The Facebook study Emotional Contagion may have demonstrated a subtle psychological effect, but it also demonstrated something far more significant. That is, in the digital era, privacy is not just about data breaches or hacked accounts. It's also very much about whether individuals retain meaningful control and awareness over how their personal information is used. And that is the lesson that continues to matter. And as we wrap up, we have some module questions for discussion. First, how would you as a researcher best determine whether behavior in a space that might be considered semi-private, such as possibly Facebook, be treated as private information? How would you identify a semi-private space from a public one? You are a researcher designing interview questions around a sensitive topic. What examples can you give for how you might structure these questions to avoid risking an intrusion of privacy? And finally, what safeguards are most appropriate when engaging with participants through electronic media, phone, text, email, that might risk unintentionally exposing their participation? Thank you.